What do you do when you install cameras to protect your home, but instead catch your wife's affair on footage? I didn't confront her. I just kept watching, documenting, and waiting for the right moment to show everyone. My name is Owen Hayes, and I have worked as a building superintendent for the past 9 years in a mid-sized apartment complex on the east side of the city. And the job has taught me that most problems in life can be solved with methodical observation and careful documentation, which is a philosophy I learned during my 6 years in the military, where I worked as a logistics observer, tracking supply chain movements and personnel access patterns across forward operating bases. The building where I work and live is a converted warehouse structure with 68 residential units spread across 5 floors, and my apartment is a modest 2-bedroom on the ground floor near the maintenance office, which means I have easy access to the building systems and also means that I hear every footstep and door closing throughout the day and night, a reality that my wife Mara used to complain about when we first moved in, but which she seemed to accept over time as simply part of the trade-off for reduced rent and proximity to my workplace. 3 weeks ago, there was a series of break-ins on the 3rd and 4th floors of the building, incidents that happened during weekday afternoons when most residents were at work, and when I was usually doing maintenance rounds in other parts of the complex or handling paperwork in the basement office. And the burglaries were not sophisticated operations, but rather simple smash and grab entries, where someone forced door locks and took electronics and jewelry that were left in obvious places. The building management company sent out an email to all residents explaining what had happened and recommending that people consider additional security measures. And several tenants asked me directly whether I thought the building was safe and whether management was going to install security cameras in the hallways. Questions that I answered as honestly as I could by saying that hallway cameras were being considered, but that the most effective security measure would be for residents to install their own camera systems in their individual units, systems that could monitor entry points and provide footage that would be admissible as evidence if anything were to happen. I brought up the idea of installing cameras in our own apartment that same evening when Mara came home from her job as a marketing analyst at a downtown consulting firm, and I explained that given the recent break-ins and given that our ground floor location made us particularly vulnerable to entry through the windows that face the side alley, it would make sense for us to install a basic 3-camera system that would cover the front door, the living room, and the kitchen area where we kept our laptops and other valuable equipment. Mara's initial reaction was resistance, and she said that cameras felt invasive and unnecessary, that we had lived in the apartment for 3 years without incident and that the recent burglaries were probably just bad luck and would not happen again, and she also said that she did not like the idea of being recorded in her own home, that it made her feel like she was under surveillance, even though I tried to explain that the cameras would only activate on motion detection and that the footage would be stored securely in a cloud account that only we would have access to. I showed her the building management email on my phone, and I pointed out that 2 separate units had been hit in the span of 1 week, and I explained that the police had told me during their investigation that the burglars were likely watching the building and tracking resident schedules to determine optimal entry times, and I said that having visible cameras in our windows might serve as a deterrent even if the cameras never captured anything useful. And after about 20 minutes of discussion, Mara reluctantly agreed that it made sense to install a basic system, as long as I promised that the cameras would not record audio, and that I would be the only one managing the footage, and that she would not have to deal with reviewing recordings or managing the cloud storage account. I ordered a 3-camera wireless system that same night from a retailer that promised next-day delivery, and when the package arrived the following afternoon, I spent about 2 hours installing the cameras in positions that I had already mapped out in my head. 1 camera aimed at the front door from a bookshelf position that gave a clear view of anyone entering or leaving, 1 camera in the living room corner that covered the main seating area and the windows that faced the alley, and 1 camera in the kitchen mounted on top of the refrigerator that captured the back door and the small dining table where we usually ate our meals. The setup process required me to download an application on my phone that would receive motion detection alerts whenever the cameras sensed movement in their fields of view, and I configured the system so that alerts would only come to my phone and not to Mara's phone, partly because she had made it clear that she did not want to be bothered with security notifications, and partly because I knew from experience that she was not particularly diligent about checking her phone during work hours and might miss important alerts if something actually happened during the day. I tested the system by walking through each camera's field of view and confirming that I received notifications within seconds, and I showed Mara how the cameras worked by pulling up the live feed on my phone and demonstrating that the video quality was clear enough to identify faces and read text on documents. And she nodded and said that it seemed like a reasonable setup, and then she went into the bedroom to change clothes and get ready for her evening workout session at the building gym, a routine that she had been following for the past 6 months ever since she had hired a personal trainer named Troy, who worked at the fitness center on the building's 2nd floor. The first week after installing the cameras was unremarkable in terms of security footage, with the system capturing only routine activity like Mara leaving for work in the morning and me coming and going throughout the day as I responded to maintenance requests from other tenants, and I reviewed the footage each evening more out of curiosity than out of any real concern, scrolling through the motion detection clips and confirming that nothing unusual had occurred during the hours when neither of us was home. On the 8th day after installation, which was a Tuesday evening, I was working my usual night shift, which ran from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, and which involved doing rounds of the building to check mechanical systems and respond to any after-hours maintenance emergencies. And at approximately 8:15, I received a motion detection alert on my phone indicating that one of the cameras in our apartment had sensed movement, which was unusual because Mara had told me that morning that she would be working late at the office and would probably not be home until after 9 o'clock. I was in the basement mechanical room checking the boiler pressure readings when the alert came through, and I pulled out my phone and opened the camera application, expecting to see that perhaps Mara had come home earlier than planned, or that maybe a package delivery person had knocked on our door. But when the live feed loaded on my screen, I saw something that made my pulse quicken and my hands go cold, which was the image of Mara standing in our apartment hallway with a man who was not me, and as I watched the footage in real time, I saw her lean toward him and kiss him in a way that was not friendly or casual, but rather intimate and prolonged. And then I watched as they moved together deeper into the apartment and out of the camera's field of view, and I stood there in the basement mechanical room holding my phone and feeling like the floor had dropped out from underneath me while the boiler hummed steadily beside me and the motion detection alert continued to flash on my screen, indicating that the camera was still recording whatever was happening in my living room. I remained in the basement mechanical room for approximately 10 minutes after seeing the footage because I needed time to process what I had just witnessed and to decide how I was going to respond. And my initial instinct was to leave my shift early and go directly to the apartment and confront both of them immediately. But my military training kicked in and reminded me that acting on emotion rather than strategy was how people made mistakes that could not be undone. And so instead, I closed the camera application on my phone and I took several deep breaths, and I forced myself to think through the situation methodically rather than reactively. The first question I needed to answer was whether this was an isolated incident or whether it was part of a pattern that had been going on for some time without my knowledge, and the second question was who the man in the footage was because the camera angle had not given me a clear view of his face, and the third question was what I wanted the outcome of this situation to be, whether I wanted to try to repair the marriage or whether I wanted to document everything and prepare for separation. And I realized as I stood there in the mechanical room that I could not answer any of these questions without more information. I decided that the most important thing I could do in that moment was to save the footage from the camera before anything happened that might cause it to be deleted or overwritten, and so I opened the camera application again and I navigated to the cloud storage interface and I downloaded the video clip from 8:15 that evening onto my phone's local storage, and then I created a new folder in my phone's file system labeled Building Security, so that if anyone ever looked at my phone, they would assume the footage was related to my work rather than to my personal life. I also went into the camera system settings and I changed the configuration so that all future motion detection clips would be saved permanently to the cloud rather than being automatically deleted after 7 days, which was the default setting. And I made sure that the notification settings were still configured to send alerts only to my phone and not to any other device, because I did not want Mara to become aware that the cameras were capturing more than just potential break-in attempts. After I had secured the initial footage, I returned to my maintenance rounds because I knew that if I deviated from my normal routine, it might raise questions from other tenants or from the building management company, and I spent the next several hours checking fire extinguishers and testing emergency lighting systems and responding to a clogged drain complaint on the 4th floor. And the entire time I was going through these mechanical motions, my mind was racing through scenarios and possibilities and trying to understand how I had missed the signs that something like this was happening. When my shift ended at 2 in the morning, I walked back to my apartment and I used my key to unlock the front door as quietly as possible. And when I stepped inside, I saw that Mara was asleep in our bedroom with the door closed and the lights off, and there was no sign that anyone else had been in the apartment recently except for a wine glass sitting on the kitchen counter that had lipstick marks on the rim, and I picked up the glass and I looked at it under the kitchen light and I recognized the shade of lipstick as one that Mara wore frequently. And I wondered whether the man who had been here had also had a glass of wine or whether Mara had been drinking alone after he left. I did not wake Mara or attempt to confront her that night because I knew that I needed to review all of the camera footage first and understand the full scope of what had been happening, and so instead I went into the small second bedroom that I used as a home office and I closed the door and I opened my laptop and I logged into the camera system's cloud storage portal, and I began scrolling backward through the archived footage from the previous 2 weeks. The process was tedious because the motion detection system had captured dozens of clips each day, showing routine movements like Mara getting ready for work in the morning or me walking through the apartment during my lunch breaks. But I created a systematic approach where I would fast forward through clips that clearly showed only Mara or only me, and I would slow down and watch carefully any clips that showed Mara entering the apartment, during times when I was supposed to be at work or on night shift duty. What I discovered during that first review session made my stomach turn and my hands shake, even though I tried to maintain the same calm, analytical mindset that I used when I was documenting maintenance issues in the building. Because over the span of the previous 14 days, the cameras had captured 5 separate occasions when Mara had brought the same man into our apartment during times when I was working, and each visit followed a similar pattern where they would enter together through the front door and move quickly into the living room, and then after approximately 30 to 45 minutes, they would reappear on camera and leave together. And on 2 occasions, the footage showed them kissing in the hallway before they left. And on 1 occasion, the footage showed the man's face clearly as he turned back to lock the door behind him, and that was when I recognized him as Troy Vance, the personal trainer who worked at the building's gym and who Mara had hired 6 months earlier to help her with what she had described as a fitness and wellness program. I spent the rest of that night creating a spreadsheet on my laptop where I documented each of the 5 visits I had found in the camera footage, noting the date and time of arrival and departure and the total duration of each visit, and then I went back through my work schedule records, and I confirmed that every single one of these visits had occurred during times when I was either on night shift or responding to maintenance emergencies in other parts of the building, which suggested that Mara and Troy were coordinating their meetings around my predictable work schedule. I also opened our shared bank account on my laptop, and I began scrolling through the transaction history for the past 2 months, looking for any unusual charges or patterns that might provide additional evidence of what was happening. And while most of the transactions were routine expenses like groceries and utilities and gas station charges, I noticed several charges from a merchant listed as Riverside Hotel Lounge that had appeared on Tuesday and Thursday evenings over the past 6 weeks. Charges that ranged from $45 to $70 and that Mara had never mentioned to me, even though we typically discussed any unusual expenses from our shared account. I clicked on one of the hotel lounge charges to see if I could get more detailed information about the transaction, and the expanded view showed me that the charge had been made on a Thursday evening at approximately 8:30. And when I cross-referenced that date with my work schedule, I saw that I had been working a night shift that evening and had not gotten home until after 2 in the morning. And when I looked at the camera footage from earlier that same day, I found a clip showing Troy arriving at our apartment at 6:15 in the evening and leaving at 7:45, which meant that there was a gap of approximately 45 minutes between when Troy left our apartment and when the hotel lounge charge appeared on our bank account. I pulled up a map on my laptop, and I confirmed that the Riverside Hotel was only a 10-minute drive from our apartment building, and I realized that the pattern I was seeing suggested that Mara and Troy were meeting at our apartment during my work shifts and then going out together to the hotel lounge afterward, and that Mara was using our joint household account to pay for drinks without any apparent concern that I might notice or question these charges. I created a second spreadsheet tab where I documented each of the hotel lounge charges alongside the corresponding camera footage dates, and I saw immediately that 4 out of the 5 apartment visits I had documented also had matching hotel charges on the same evening, which provided a clear pattern of coordination and planning rather than spontaneous or impulsive behavior. By the time the sun started to rise and I heard Mara's alarm clock going off in the bedroom, I had compiled a detailed evidence file that included video footage of 5 separate apartment visits, bank records showing 4 hotel lounge charges that corresponded with those visits, and a work schedule analysis that proved every incident had occurred during times when Mara knew I would be away from the apartment for extended periods, and I saved all of this documentation into the encrypted folder on my laptop, and I closed the computer, and I walked into the bathroom to shower and get ready for my day shift. And when Mara emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later wearing her work clothes and carrying her purse and her laptop bag, I greeted her with the same good morning that I always said, and I asked her if she wanted me to make coffee, and she smiled and said, "Yes, please." And she kissed me on the cheek before sitting down at the kitchen table to check her phone, and I stood at the coffee maker watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, and I wondered how many more times I would have this same ordinary morning routine with someone who I now understood was living a completely different life than the one I had believed we were sharing together. I continued my normal work routine throughout the rest of that week because I understood that the most important thing I could do was maintain the appearance that nothing had changed while I gathered additional evidence and figured out exactly what I was dealing with. And every time Mara came home from work or left for one of her gym sessions with Troy, I acted exactly the same way I had always acted, asking about her day and listening to her stories about office politics and client meetings, and nodding in the appropriate places, even though the entire time I was wondering how much of what she was telling me was true, and how much was carefully constructed fiction designed to cover up what she was actually doing with her time. On Saturday morning, which was 5 days after I had first discovered the footage of Myra and Troy in our apartment, I had plans to meet my best friend Ben Carver for coffee at our usual spot, which was a small independent cafe about 15 minutes from the building, and Ben and I had been meeting there almost every Saturday morning for the past 2 years to catch up and talk about fishing plans and complain about work, and generally maintain the kind of friendship that requires regular low-stakes interaction to survive. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes before 9 o'clock, and I ordered my usual black coffee, and I sat down at our regular table near the front window, and when Ben walked in a few minutes later, he was carrying a tackle box catalog that he wanted to show me and talking about some new lure design that he thought would be perfect for the base fishing trip we were planning for next month. We spent the first 20 minutes of our conversation going through the catalog and debating the merits of different fishing equipment, and I tried to focus on what Ben was saying and to participate in the conversation normally, but I could feel my attention drifting because part of my mind was still running through the evidence I had compiled and trying to determine what my next steps should be, and I must have seemed distracted because Ben eventually set down the catalog and asked me directly if everything was okay, if there was something going on that I wanted to talk about. I considered telling Ben everything right then, showing him the footage on my phone and explaining what I had discovered and asking for his advice about how to handle the situation, but something stopped me from doing that because I realized that once I told someone else about what was happening, it would become real in a way that it was not yet real, as long as I kept it to myself. And I also knew that Ben was friends with Mara too, and that putting him in a position where he had to choose sides or keep secrets would be unfair to him. And so instead, I told him that I was just dealing with some complicated building maintenance issues and that I was fine. And I steered the conversation back to fishing and let him talk about his plans for the upcoming season. We had been sitting there for about 40 minutes and were getting ready to leave when Ben mentioned casually that he had seen Mara earlier in the week at a different coffee shop downtown, and he said it in the kind of offhand way that suggested he did not think the information was particularly important or interesting, but as soon as he said it, I felt my entire body tense up because I knew that this might be the kind of independent corroboration that would be valuable to document. I asked Ben which coffee shop he had seen her at, and what day it had been, trying to keep my tone casual and mildly curious rather than intense or investigative, and Ben thought for a moment and said that it had been Tuesday morning around 10 o'clock at a place called Ember Coffee that was near his office building downtown, and he said that Mara had been sitting at one of the tables with a guy who looked like he worked at a gym based on the athletic clothes and the very fit appearance, and Ben described the man as tall, with a sleeve of tattoos on his left arm and dark hair pulled back in a small ponytail. And I knew immediately that he was describing Troy, even though Ben had no way of knowing who Troy was or what significance this sighting might have. I asked Ben if they had seemed like they were having a business meeting or a casual conversation, and Ben said that it definitely seemed casual, that they were laughing a lot and sitting close together, and that at one point he saw the guy reach across the table and touch Mara's hand. And Ben said he had almost gone over to say hello, but he was running late for a client meeting, and so he had just waved from across the room and kept walking, and he said that Mara had not seemed to notice him because she was focused on her conversation with the gym guy. I absorbed this information while trying to keep my expression neutral and uninterested, and then I asked Ben if he would be willing to do me a favor and write down exactly what he had just told me, including the date and time and location and description of what he had seen. And I could see the confusion on Ben's face as he asked why I needed a written statement about Mara having coffee with someone, and I told him that it might be relevant for some insurance documentation that I was putting together related to building security and resident activity patterns, which was a vague enough explanation that it could have been true even though it was completely false. And Ben looked at me skeptically for a moment, but then he shrugged and said, "Sure," and he pulled out his phone and typed up a few sentences describing what he had seen, and then he texted the message to me so that I would have it in writing with a timestamp. I thanked Ben and told him I appreciated his help with the documentation, and then we finished our coffee and made plans to meet again the following Saturday, and we went our separate ways. And as I walked back to my truck, I pulled out my phone and I read through Ben's text message several times, noting that the date he had mentioned was a Tuesday and that 10 o'clock in the morning was a time when Mara was supposed to be at her office for a team meeting that she had told me about the night before, which meant that her Tuesday morning schedule was not what she had claimed it was. I drove back to the apartment building, and I went directly to my home office, and I opened my evidence spreadsheet, and I created a new entry for Ben's witness statement, and I copied the text of his message into the spreadsheet along with the date and time and location, and then I went back through my phone records, and I found the text message that Mara had sent me that same Tuesday at 10:30, saying that her morning meeting had run long and that she probably would not have time for lunch, and I took a screenshot of that text message and I saved it in the same folder as the camera footage and the bank statements. I sat at my desk looking at the growing collection of evidence, and I realized that what I was documenting was not a single mistake or a moment of weakness, but rather a coordinated pattern of deception that had been going on for weeks or possibly months. And I understood that Mara had been constructing an entire alternate version of her schedule and her activities that allowed her to spend time with Troy while making me believe that she was at work meetings or gym sessions or other legitimate appointments. I pulled up our shared Google Calendar on my laptop, and I began scrolling through the entries from the past 2 months, looking for any appointments or events that Mara had added that might correspond with the dates when I had camera footage of Troy visiting the apartment, or when I had found hotel lounge charges on our bank account. And I discovered that on 3 of the 5 documented apartment visits, Mara had created calendar entries labeled Client Presentation Prep or Quarterly Review Planning that were scheduled during late afternoon hours when she would normally have been finishing up her workday. And I realized that these calendar entries were part of the alibi structure she had built to explain why she was not immediately available or why she might be getting home later than usual. I took screenshots of each of these calendar entries, and I added them to my evidence folder, and then I created a new document where I started building a comprehensive timeline that showed Mara's claimed schedule on the left side and her actual documented activities on the right side, with entries like claimed, client presentation prep 6 p.m. Adarius Cairo Workation, and actual Troy visit to apartment 4:15 and 5:45 p.m. per camera footage, and claimed team meeting 9:11 a.m., actual coffee with Troy at Ember Coffee 10 a.m. per witness statement. And as I worked on this timeline, I could feel my anger building, but I forced it down because I knew that anger would make me sloppy, and that what I needed right now was clarity and precision. When I finished the timeline document, I printed out 2 copies, one that I put in a locked drawer in my desk, and one that I folded and put in my wallet, and I decided that I was going to carry that second copy with me everywhere I went, because I wanted to have physical evidence available if I ever needed to show someone what I had discovered, and I also wanted the constant reminder in my pocket that would keep me focused on documentation rather than confrontation, because I knew that the moment I confronted Mara directly, she would either deny everything, or she would try to turn the situation around and make it about my supposed surveillance or controlling behavior, and I wanted to make sure that by the time any confrontation happened, I would have enough evidence that there would be no possible way for her to rewrite the narrative or claim that I was misunderstanding innocent interactions. I spent the next several days continuing to monitor the camera footage and cross-referencing new motion detection alerts with my work schedule and with Mara's explanations for where she was and what she was doing. And during this period, I noticed that the frequency of Troy's visits to our apartment seemed to be increasing rather than decreasing, which suggested that either they were becoming more careless about hiding their activity or they had reached a level of comfort that made them believe they would not be caught. On Thursday afternoon, I received a motion detection alert at approximately 3:30 while I was replacing a broken garbage disposal unit in a 4th-floor apartment. And when I checked the camera feed on my phone, I saw Mara and Troy entering our apartment together. And this time, instead of just watching the live feed for a few seconds and then closing the application, I left it running in my pocket with the sound muted so that I would have a continuous record of how long they stayed and what time they left. And when I finally checked my phone again 2 hours later, the feed showed that they had departed at 5:15, which meant they had been in my apartment alone together for nearly 2 full hours in the middle of a weekday afternoon. That evening, when Mara came home around 7 o'clock carrying takeout food from a Thai restaurant we both liked, she told me that she had spent the afternoon working from home because she needed quiet time to finish a presentation that was due the next morning and the office had been too noisy and distracting. And she said this with the same casual tone she used when talking about any routine work matter. And I nodded and asked her how the presentation was coming along and whether she felt prepared for the meeting, and she launched into a detailed description of the client requirements and the proposal structure and the competitive positioning strategy. And the entire time she was talking, I was thinking about the footage on my phone that showed her walking into our apartment, with Troy at 3:30 and kissing him in the hallway before they moved deeper into the living space where the cameras could not capture what happened next. I ate the Thai food that Mara had brought home, and I made appropriate comments about the flavors and the spice level, and I asked whether she wanted to watch something on television after dinner, and she said she was too tired and that she needed to get to bed early because tomorrow was going to be a long day with back-to-back client meetings. And I watched her walk into the bedroom and close the door, and I sat alone in the living room thinking about how completely and thoroughly she was lying to me about every single aspect of her day, and wondering whether she felt any guilt or remorse, or whether this had simply become her new normal routine. The following morning, I called the bank that held our shared checking account, and I asked to speak with someone about getting detailed transaction records for the past 3 months, and the customer service representative told me that I could access most of that information through the online banking portal, but that if I needed itemized receipts or additional details about specific merchants, I would need to come into a branch location and make a formal request. I checked my work schedule, and I saw that I had a 2-hour gap in the early afternoon between a scheduled HVAC inspection and a tenant move-out walkthrough, and so I drove to the nearest branch of our bank, and I sat down with a personal banker, and I explained that I needed detailed receipts for all transactions at a specific merchant called Riverside Hotel Lounge. And the banker asked me whether there was a problem with any of the charges, and I told her no, that I just needed the documentation for personal record-keeping purposes. And she seemed satisfied with that explanation, and she typed some information into her computer, and then she printed out a series of receipts that showed not just the dates and amounts of the charges, but also the specific times when the transactions had been processed. I took the printed receipts, and I spread them out on the banker's desk, and I looked at the timestamps, and I saw that the 4 hotel lounge charges I had previously identified in our online banking portal had all been processed between 8 and 9:30 in the evening, which was consistent with my theory that Mara and Troy were meeting at our apartment first during my work shifts and then going out to the hotel lounge afterward for drinks or dinner or whatever else they were doing together in public spaces where they apparently felt safe from being recognized or reported. I asked the banker whether the receipts showed any additional details, such as what items had been purchased, or how many people the charges were for, and she said that the merchant only provided aggregate totals to the bank, and that if I wanted itemized information, I would need to contact the hotel directly. But she did note that 3 of the 4 charges included a line item labeled gratuity, which suggested that they were table service transactions rather than bar purchases. And I thanked her for the information, and I folded the printed receipts carefully, and I put them in the same folder in my truck, where I had been storing all of my other evidence documents. I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot for several minutes looking at the receipts and doing mental calculations about the timeline, because if Troy left our apartment around 6 or 7 in the evening, based on the camera footage patterns I had observed, and if the hotel charges were processing between 8 and 9:30, that meant there was a window of time when they were together somewhere between leaving my apartment and arriving at the hotel lounge, and I wondered whether they were being cautious and taking separate vehicles to avoid being seen together, or whether they were driving together and simply spending time somewhere else first before going to the hotel. I pulled out my phone and I searched for the address of the Riverside Hotel, and I entered it into my Maps application, and I saw that the drive from my apartment building to the hotel would take approximately 12 minutes under normal traffic conditions, which meant that even accounting for parking and walking into the building, there should not be more than a 20 or 25-minute gap between when they left my apartment and when they would reasonably arrive at the hotel, and yet the timestamp suggested they were taking closer to an hour or more to make that transition. I realized that I needed to know more about what the Riverside Hotel actually was and what kind of establishment would generate the charges I was seeing on our bank account. And so I clicked on the hotel's website and I read through the description of their amenities and services. And I learned that the Riverside was a boutique hotel that marketed itself as an intimate getaway destination with a ground floor lounge and restaurant that was open to the public as well as room service available to hotel guests. And the website showed photographs of dimly lit dining spaces with small tables and romantic ambiance, exactly the kind of place where 2 people having an affair might feel comfortable meeting without worrying about being noticed by casual acquaintances or neighbors. I called the hotel's main phone number, and when someone answered, I explained that I was calling about some charges that had appeared on my credit card from their establishment, and I provided the dates of the transactions and asked whether the customer service representative could tell me whether these were charges from the public restaurant or from room service, and the person on the phone said that they could not provide bank had given me, and after a brief hold, the customer service representative came back on the line and told me that all 4 of the charges I had asked about were from room service rather than from the public restaurant, which meant that Mara had been ordering food and drinks to a hotel room and charging it to our shared bank account on evenings when she had told me she was working late, or meeting friends, or attending networking events. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I processed this information because it meant that the affair was not just happening in my apartment when I was at work, but was also extending to hotel rooms where they apparently felt comfortable enough to order room service and spend extended periods of time together. And I asked the customer service representative whether they could tell me whose name the hotel room had been registered under. And they said they could not release that information without a subpoena or without written permission from the person who had made the reservation, but then they paused and added that they could tell me that the payment method on file for the room charges was different from the payment method used for the room service orders, which suggested to me that someone else had paid for the actual hotel room while Mara had used our joint account to pay for the food and drinks. I thanked the customer service representative and I ended the call, and I sat in my truck staring at the printed receipts and thinking about the implications of what I had just learned. Because if Troy was paying for hotel rooms with his own money or credit card that would not show up on any account that his wife Rebecca could see, but then allowing Mara to charge room service to our joint household account, that suggested a level of planning and coordination that went beyond spontaneous affair behavior and indicated that they had worked out a system where each of them was managing their financial exposure in a way that minimized the risk of discovery by their respective spouses. I started my truck and I drove back toward the apartment building, but instead of going straight there, I detoured past the Riverside Hotel so that I could see the physical location and get a sense of the layout and the parking situation. And as I drove slowly past the entrance, I saw that it was exactly the kind of discreet upscale establishment that would appeal to people who wanted privacy and who were willing to pay premium prices for it. And I made a mental note of the valet stand and the side parking lot, and the fact that the entrance was set back from the main street in a way that would make it difficult for anyone to casually observe who was coming and going. I returned to the apartment building and parked my truck in the maintenance bay behind the main structure, and as I was walking toward the entrance, I heard my phone buzz with a text message from Mara saying that she was going to be late getting home because she had a dinner meeting with a potential client that had been scheduled at the last minute, and she said not to wait up for her, and that she would probably just grab something to eat at the restaurant and come straight home afterward. I looked at the timestamp on the message, which showed 4:45 in the afternoon, and I calculated that if this was following the same pattern as the previous hotel visits, then Troy would likely be leaving our apartment sometime in the next hour or so, and then they would meet up at the Riverside Hotel for what Mara was describing as a client dinner, and I felt a surge of anger mixed with something close to admiration at how smoothly and casually she could send me these lies while presumably sitting in our apartment with her lover or getting ready to leave with him for their evening together. I went to my office in the building, and I sat down at my desk, and I opened the evidence spreadsheet on my laptop. And I added a new entry documenting Mara's text message about the supposed client dinner, along with a note that I would check the bank account tomorrow to see if another Riverside Hotel charge appeared, and as I was typing, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office, and then a knock on the door, and when I called out that it was open, the door swung inward, and one of the building tenants came in to ask about getting a second parking permit for a visiting family member. I helped the tenant with the parking permit paperwork and answered a few questions about guest policies. And the entire time I was going through these routine administrative tasks, part of my mind was thinking about Mara and Troy and wondering whether they had any idea that I knew what they were doing or whether they felt completely secure in their deception. And I realized that the fact that I had not confronted Mara or changed my behavior in any noticeable way probably made them feel safe and confident that they could continue indefinitely. That evening, after I finished my regular maintenance rounds, I went back to the apartment around 11 o'clock. Which was earlier than usual for a weeknight, but still late enough that Mara would not find it suspicious. And when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I saw that all the lights were off, and Mara's purse and keys were on the kitchen counter, which indicated that she had come home at some point while I was working. I walked quietly into the bedroom, and I could see in the dim light from the street lamp outside that Mara was asleep in bed, with her back turned toward the door. And I stood there for a moment, watching her breathe in the steady rhythm of deep sleep, and I thought about how easy it would be to wake her up right now and tell her that I knew everything and demand explanations and apologies. But I also knew that doing so would end my ability to continue documenting the affair and would give her the opportunity to construct whatever narrative she wanted about why it had happened and whose fault it really was. Instead of waking her, I went back out to the living room, and I opened the camera application on my phone, and I reviewed the footage from earlier in the evening, and just as I had predicted, the recording showed Troy arriving at the apartment at 5:20 and leaving at 6:45, and then there was no additional activity until Mara returned alone at 10:15, which meant she had been out for more than 3 hours after Troy left, and was presumably at the Riverside Hotel with him during that time. I saved these video clips to my secure folder, and I made notes about the timestamps, and then I did something that I had been avoiding up until this point, which was to open our shared cloud photo storage account to see if there were any images that might provide additional evidence of what Mara had been doing during her time with Troy, and I knew that looking through her photos felt like a violation of privacy, but I justified it to myself by reasoning that this was a shared account that we both had access to, and that I was not hacking into anything or bypassing any security measures. I scrolled through the photo timeline starting from 2 months ago and working backward toward the present, and most of the images were exactly what I expected to see: pictures of meals that Mara had cooked, or screenshots of articles she had saved, or photos of flowers in the community garden behind our building. But as I continued scrolling, I found several photographs that made me stop and look more carefully because they appeared to have been taken in hotel rooms. Images that showed champagne glasses on nightstands and views through windows that looked out over the city from what appeared to be upper floors of buildings. And although none of these photos showed Troy or showed anything explicitly incriminating, I clicked on each image to view the metadata information, and I saw that the location data embedded in the photo files indicated they had been taken at various hotels around the city, including 2 that showed coordinates matching the Riverside Hotel address. I took screenshots of these hotel room photos along with their metadata panels showing the dates and GPS coordinates, and I added them to my evidence folder with notes about which photos corresponded to which bank charges and camera footage dates. And I realized as I was doing this documentation work that Mara had been photographing her time with Troy and storing the images in our shared cloud account, either because she was not thinking about the fact that I had access to the same storage system, or because she had become so comfortable with the affair that she no longer felt the need to be careful about covering her tracks. I found one particular photo that had been taken 3 weeks earlier, showing a view from a hotel window at dusk with the city lights beginning to come on. And when I checked the metadata, I saw that it had been taken at 7:35 on a Thursday evening, and when I cross-referenced that date with my evidence spreadsheet, I found that there was a Riverside Hotel room service charge on our bank account. From that same evening at 8:10, which meant Mara had been in the hotel room taking romantic sunset photos, and then ordering room service less than an hour later, and the level of comfort and routine that this suggested made me understand that what I was dealing with was not a recent development or a brief lapse in judgment, but rather a fully established parallel relationship that had its own rhythms and patterns and rituals. I closed the photo application, and I sat on the couch in the dark living room, and I thought about the conversation I had overheard earlier in the week when I had come home unexpectedly during the afternoon and had heard Mara talking on the phone in the bedroom with the door mostly closed, and at the time I had not paid much attention to the muffled words I could hear through the door because I assumed she was having a work call or talking to one of her friends. But now, as I sat there in the quiet apartment, I tried to reconstruct what I had heard, and I remembered catching fragments of phrases like, "He is always checking up on me," and "I feel trapped," and "I need to think about my options." And I realized with a cold clarity that Mara had not been talking to a friend about general life stress, but had been talking to her mother and had been laying the groundwork for some kind of exit strategy where she would position herself as the victim of a controlling or suspicious husband. I stood up from the couch, and I walked quietly back toward the bedroom, moving slowly so that the old floorboards would not creak under my weight, and I stood outside the closed bedroom door and I listened carefully to see if Mara was actually asleep or if she was awake and perhaps on her phone. And after a minute of silence, I heard her voice speaking softly, and I realized she was having a phone conversation at nearly midnight. And I pressed my ear closer to the door, and I could hear her saying things like, "I know it has been hard, and I just need to get everything organized first, and maybe in a few weeks I can come stay with you for a while." And I understood that she was talking to her mother again and was continuing to build the narrative that she was unhappy in our marriage and was considering leaving. And what struck me most about overhearing this conversation was not the content of what she was saying, but rather the tone of her voice, which was calm and measured and strategic rather than emotional or distressed, as if she was executing a plan rather than processing genuine feelings of unhappiness or dissatisfaction. I moved away from the bedroom door, and I went into the small second bedroom that served as my home office, and I sat down at my desk, and I opened a new document on my laptop. And I began typing out everything I had just overheard along with the date and time and my best recollection of the exact phrases Mara had used. And I knew that I could not record her phone conversations without her knowledge because that would be illegal in our state, but I could document my own observations and recollections of what I had heard while standing in my own apartment. And I signed and dated the document, and I saved it to my evidence folder with a file name that indicated it was a personal witness statement rather than recorded audio. I sat at my desk for a long time after finishing that document, and I thought about what my next steps should be, because it was becoming clear to me that Mara was not just having an affair, but was actively planning to leave the marriage while simultaneously constructing a narrative that would make her departure look justified and reasonable. And I realized that if I did not take action soon to document everything and protect my own interests, then I would find myself in a situation where I was defending against accusations of being controlling or emotionally abusive, or whatever other characterizations Mara was preparing to deploy in order to explain why she had needed to seek connection and validation elsewhere. I decided that I needed to take action on 2 fronts simultaneously. And the first front was to continue documenting Mara's affair with as much evidence as possible so that when the inevitable confrontation came, I would have an airtight case that could not be disputed or reframed. And the second front was to begin addressing the professional dimension of what was happening, which was that Troy Vance was using his position as a personal trainer at the building gym to conduct an affair with a client who happened to be a building resident, and I knew from my years of working in property management that most fitness facilities have strict policies about trainers engaging in personal or romantic relationships with clients because of the inherent power dynamics and the potential for liability issues. I pulled up the building gym's membership agreement on my laptop, which was a document that all residents had to sign when they registered to use the fitness center, and I scrolled through the various sections covering hours of operation and equipment usage rules and liability waivers until I found the section titled Trainer Conduct and Professional Boundaries. And I read through the language carefully, and I noted that there was a specific clause stating that gym staff members were prohibited from engaging in personal relationships with clients that could compromise professional boundaries or create conflicts of interest. And the clause further stated that violations of this policy could result in immediate termination of the staff member's employment and revocation of their building access privileges. I printed out a copy of this policy section, and I highlighted the relevant clause with a yellow marker, and then I drafted a formal written complaint addressed to the building gym manager describing in general terms that I had reason to believe one of the trainers was violating the professional boundaries policy by engaging in an inappropriate personal relationship with a client. And I was careful in how I worded the complaint because I did not want to provide so much detail that it would be immediately obvious I was talking about my own wife, but I needed to provide enough information that the gym management would be obligated to open an investigation. I included in the complaint a reference to the specific policy clause that was being violated, and I noted that I had documentary evidence, including time-stamped records, that demonstrated a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. And I concluded the complaint by requesting that the gym conduct a formal review of the trainer's conduct and take appropriate disciplinary action in accordance with building policies. And I printed out 2 copies of this complaint letter, one that I would submit to the gym manager and one that I would keep for my own records. The next morning, which was a Friday, I waited until I saw that the gym manager's office light was on, which usually happened around 8:30 when he arrived to handle administrative work before the morning rush of residents coming in for their pre-work exercise routines, and I walked down to the second floor with my printed complaint letter in a manila folder, and I knocked on the gym manager's door and waited for him to call me in. The gym manager was a man named Derek Mills, who had been working at the building for about 3 years and who I had always had a cordial professional relationship with. And when I entered his office, he looked up from his computer screen and greeted me and asked what he could help me with, and I told him that I needed to file a formal complaint regarding a potential policy violation by one of his training staff. And I could see his expression shift from casual friendliness to professional concern as he gestured for me to sit down and asked me to explain the situation. I handed him the complaint letter, and I waited while he read through it, and when he finished, he set the paper down on his desk, and he looked at me with a mixture of skepticism and discomfort, and he said that this was a serious allegation, and that he would need to understand more about what evidence I had and why I believed a policy violation had occurred. I told him that I had time-stamped camera footage showing the trainer in question making repeated visits to a client's apartment during times that were clearly personal rather than professional in nature, and that I had documented at least 11 separate visits over a 6-week period. And I said that while I preferred not to disclose the specific identities of the people involved at this stage, I was prepared to provide the documentary evidence to him if he opened a formal investigation. And I reminded him that the building's own policy required gym management to take these kinds of complaints seriously and to investigate them promptly because of the potential liability issues for the building ownership. Derek shifted in his chair and asked me if the client in question had filed a complaint or expressed any concern about the trainer's behavior, and I told him that the nature of the policy violation was such that the client might not be aware that boundaries were being crossed or might not feel comfortable coming forward, and that the purpose of having clear professional conduct policies was precisely to protect both clients and the facility from situations where personal relationships could compromise the integrity of the trainer-client dynamic. Derek asked me if I could tell him which trainer I was referring to, and I paused for a moment, and then I told him that it was Troy Vance. And I watched his face carefully as I said the name because I wanted to see if there was any recognition or concern. And I saw Derek's jaw tighten slightly, which suggested to me that perhaps Troy had been the subject of informal complaints or concerns before, even if nothing had been formally documented. Derek told me that he would need some time to review the policy and to consult with the building's human resources liaison about how to proceed with an investigation, and he asked me if I could provide him with copies of the documentary evidence I had mentioned, and I told him that I would prepare a summary document with selected still frames from the camera footage showing dates and times of visits, but that I would redact certain identifying details until the investigation was officially opened, and Derek nodded and said that was reasonable and that he would get back to me within 48 hours about next steps. I left Derek's office and I walked back to my own workspace feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction because I had taken a concrete action that would put official pressure on Troy and would potentially result in professional consequences for his behavior, but anxiety because I knew that once the gym investigation began, there was a chance that word would get back to Troy that someone had filed a complaint and that he might confront me or might warn Mara that their affair was at risk of being exposed. I spent the rest of that morning preparing the evidence summary that I had promised to provide to Derek, and I selected 5 of the clearest camera footage still frames showing Troy entering and leaving the apartment. At times when I was documented as being on night shift, and I arranged these images in a grid with timestamps and date stamps clearly visible, and I added a text annotation at the bottom stating, "Sample documentation of repeated non-professional visits to client residence during documented work schedule of client's spouse." And I saved this summary as a PDF file that I could email to Derek or print out, depending on what format he preferred. While I was working on this documentation, I received a text message from Mara saying that she was planning to go to the gym after work for a training session with Troy, and that she would probably be home around 7:30. And I looked at this message, and I felt a dark satisfaction knowing that this might be one of the last training sessions she would be able to schedule with Troy if the gym investigation proceeded the way I expected it to. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Derek asking me to come back to his office because he had consulted with the building's HR liaison, and they had decided to open a formal investigation into the complaint I had filed. And when I arrived at his office, Derek handed me a form titled Formal Complaint Intake Documentation, and asked me to fill it out with as much detail as I could provide while still maintaining appropriate confidentiality about the identities of the people involved. I filled out the form carefully, providing specific dates and times of observed policy violations and describing the nature of the documentary evidence I had compiled, and when I handed the completed form back to Derek, he reviewed it, and then he told me that based on the information I had provided, the gym would be suspending Troy Vance's training privileges pending a full review of his conduct, and that Troy would be notified of the suspension later that same day and would be required to meet with gym management and building HR to respond to the allegations before any final determination was made about his employment status. I thanked Derek for taking the complaint seriously, and I left his office knowing that I had just set in motion a sequence of events that would likely result in Troy losing his job at the building gym and possibly losing his access to the building altogether, and I wondered how long it would take before Mara found out that Troy had been suspended and whether she would connect his suspension to me or whether she would assume it was related to some other complaint or issue. I went back to my apartment, and I checked the camera system to make sure it was still recording properly, and then I sat down at my desk, and I updated my evidence spreadsheet with a new entry documenting the formal complaint filing and the gym's decision to suspend Troy pending investigation. And I realized as I was typing that I was now approaching a point where I would need to make a decision about whether to continue watching and documenting silently, or whether to take the next step and confront Mara directly with everything I had discovered. That evening around 6 o'clock, I received a text message from Mara that was much different in tone from her earlier message about going to the gym, and this new message said that her training session had been canceled because Troy was dealing with some kind of work issue and that she was just going to come straight home instead, and I could detect in the phrasing of her message a note of confusion or concern that suggested she did not fully understand why her session had been canceled or what kind of work issue Troy was dealing with. I received a text message from Mara's mother on Saturday morning asking if I would be available to come to her house for Sunday dinner the following day, which was unusual because typically these family dinner invitations came from Mara rather than directly from her mother. And the message had a slightly formal tone that suggested this was not just a casual social gathering, but rather something that had been specifically planned or orchestrated. I responded that I would be happy to attend, and I asked if I should bring anything, and Mara's mother replied that I should just bring myself and that she was looking forward to seeing me, and I noticed that her response did not include any mention of Mara or whether Mara would also be attending, which struck me as odd, given that these family dinners were typically framed as events where both of us would be present together as a couple. I went into the bedroom where Mara was working on her laptop, and I asked her if she knew about the dinner invitation from her mother, and she looked up with an expression that seemed caught between surprise and discomfort, and she said that yes, her mother had mentioned something about wanting to have family over on Sunday, but that she had not realized her mother was going to extend a direct invitation to me. I asked Mara if there was some reason I should not attend, or if this was meant to be a private family gathering that did not include me, and she quickly said no. Of course I should come, and that she just had not had a chance to mention it to me yet, because everything had been so hectic at work, and I could tell from the way she was avoiding eye contact with me that there was something about this dinner that she was uncomfortable discussing. And I made a mental note that I should be prepared for the possibility that this family gathering might be connected to whatever exit strategy Mara had been discussing with her mother during those late-night phone conversations I had overheard. I spent the rest of Saturday gathering and organizing my evidence documentation because I had a strong intuition that Sunday's dinner might turn into some kind of confrontation or conversation about the state of our marriage. And I wanted to make sure that if I needed to present evidence, I would have everything readily accessible and clearly organized. And so I printed out a complete copy of my timeline spreadsheet showing the dates and times of Troy's apartment visits alongside Mara's claimed activities and alibis, and I also printed out selected camera footage still frames and bank statement excerpts showing the hotel charges, and I put all of these documents into a leather portfolio folder that I could bring with me to the dinner if the situation required it. Sunday afternoon arrived, and I drove to Mara's parents' house, which was a modest single-story home in a residential neighborhood about 20 minutes from our apartment building. And when I pulled into the driveway, I saw that there were already 3 other cars parked there, including Mara's car and her brother's car, and what I assumed was her sister-in-law's car, which meant that this was going to be a larger gathering than just immediate family. I walked up to the front door carrying the leather portfolio folder under my arm, and before I could knock, the door opened and Mara's mother greeted me with a hug that felt slightly stiff and formal, and she led me into the dining room where the rest of the family was already seated around the table with place settings arranged for 6 people. Mara was sitting at one end of the table next to her brother Marcus, and across from them were Mara's father and her sister-in-law, and there was an empty chair at the other end of the table that appeared to be designated for me, and I noticed that this seating arrangement placed me directly across from Mara at maximum distance, which seemed deliberately designed to create a formal, confrontational atmosphere rather than the casual family dinner I had been led to expect. Mara's father stood up as I entered the room, and he shook my hand with a grip that was firm but not warm, and he gestured for me to sit down in the empty chair. And once I was seated, Mara's mother brought out serving dishes with pot roast and vegetables and placed them in the center of the table, and there was an uncomfortable silence as everyone began passing dishes and filling their plates, and I could feel multiple sets of eyes glancing at me and then looking away, as if everyone at the table knew something that I was supposed to know but did not. Finally, after several minutes of this awkward silent meal service, Mara's mother set down her serving spoon, and she looked directly at me, and she said that she wanted to talk to me about some concerns that Mara had shared with her regarding our marriage, and she said that as Mara's mother, she felt it was important to create a space where these concerns could be discussed openly, and where hopefully we could find some path forward that would be healthy for everyone involved. I set down my fork, and I looked at Mara, and I asked her directly what concerns she had shared with her mother, and Mara looked down at her plate, and she said in a quiet voice that she had been feeling for a long time like I was overly controlling and suspicious, that I monitored her schedule and questioned where she was and made her feel like she had to account for every minute of her time, and she said that the installation of the security cameras in our apartment had made her feel like she was under constant surveillance and that she could not relax or be herself in her own home. I listened to this characterization of my behavior, and I felt a cold anger building in my chest because I recognized immediately that this was the narrative she had been constructing during those phone conversations with her mother, and I realized that I was being positioned as the problem in the marriage while Mara's own behavior was being completely erased from the story, and I made a decision in that moment that I was not going to allow this narrative to stand unchallenged, regardless of the social awkwardness it might create at a family dinner table. I reached down and picked up the leather portfolio folder that I had brought with me, and I set it on the table in front of me. And I told Mara's family that before we continued with this conversation, I wanted to make sure that everyone had access to complete and accurate information about what had actually been happening in our marriage over the past several months. And I could see Mara's face go pale as I opened the folder and pulled out the first page of my timeline spreadsheet. I slid the timeline across the table so that it was positioned in the center where everyone could see it, and I explained in the same calm, factual tone that I used when I was documenting building maintenance issues that I had installed security cameras in our apartment after a series of burglaries in the building, and that those cameras had captured footage that I wanted the family to be aware of before making any judgments about who was being controlling or suspicious in our marriage. Mara's father picked up the timeline and he began reading it, and I watched his expression change from confusion to concern to something that looked like anger as he processed the information in front of him. And he passed the timeline to Mara's mother, who read it with her hand covering her mouth. And then it was passed to Marcus, who looked at it and then looked at Mara with an expression of disbelief. I pulled out several of the printed camera footage still frames that showed Troy entering and leaving our apartment, with timestamps clearly visible. And I passed these around the table as well, and then I pulled out the bank statement excerpts showing the Riverside Hotel charges, and I explained that these charges had appeared on our shared household account on the same evenings when the camera footage showed Troy visiting our apartment. And I noted that when I had called the hotel to verify the nature of these charges, I had been told that they were for room service rather than for the public restaurant, which indicated that Mara had been in a hotel room ordering food and drinks while I was away working night shifts. Mara tried to interrupt, and she started to say that I was taking things out of context and that the situation was more complicated than it appeared, but her father held up his hand and told her to be quiet, and he asked me directly whether anything I had just presented was factually inaccurate or whether there were any errors in the dates or times that I had documented. I told him that every piece of information in the timeline had been verified through multiple sources, including camera footage, timestamps, bank transaction records, and in some cases witness statements from people who had seen Mara and Troy together in public locations when she had claimed to be somewhere else, And I said that I had been documenting this pattern for several weeks before deciding to bring it to the family's attention, and that the only reason I was presenting it now was because Mara had apparently been telling her mother that I was the one who was behaving inappropriately in our marriage. Mara's mother asked in a voice that was shaking slightly whether the timeline was showing what she thought it was showing, whether Mara had actually been having an affair with her personal trainer, and I told her that based on the evidence I had compiled that appeared to be the most reasonable interpretation of the documented pattern of behavior, and that I had not jumped to conclusions or made accusations without first gathering substantial proof that could not be easily explained away or reframed. Marcus spoke up and asked Mara directly whether she wanted to explain what was going on or whether she was going to continue sitting there in silence, and Mara finally looked up from her plate and she said with tears starting to form in her eyes that yes, she had developed a relationship with Troy, but that it had happened because she felt so lonely and disconnected in her marriage to me, and that I was always working night shifts or doing building maintenance and was never emotionally available to her, and she said that Troy had given her the attention and validation that she was not getting at home. I listened to this explanation, and I pulled out another document from my portfolio folder, which was a printed copy of the text messages Mara had sent me during the times when Troy was documented as being in our apartment. Messages where she had told me she was working from home quietly or having a relaxing evening alone, and I placed these side by side with the camera footage timestamps, and I let the contradiction speak for itself. I watched as Mara's family members passed the text message printouts around the table and compared them with the camera footage timestamps, and the silence in the room was heavy and uncomfortable as each person processed the clear evidence that Mara had been systematically lying, not just to me, but also to herself, about what her evenings alone at home actually consisted of when I was away working my shifts. Mara's father set down the documents he had been reviewing, and he looked at his daughter with an expression that combined disappointment and something that might have been sadness. And he said in a measured voice that he was having difficulty understanding how she could justify what appeared to be months of deliberate deception, regardless of whatever unhappiness she might have been feeling in her marriage, and he asked her directly whether she had considered the impact of her choices not just on me, but on the entire family and on her own integrity as a person. Mara tried to respond, but her words came out in fragmented pieces about how the situation was more nuanced than it looked on paper, and how feelings were complicated, and how she never intended to hurt anyone, and her mother interrupted and said that intentions were less important than actions, and that the documentation I had presented showed a clear pattern of choices that Mara had made repeatedly over an extended period of time, and that those choices could not be explained away by claiming emotional unavailability or loneliness, because those were feelings that should have been addressed through honest conversation or counseling, rather than through establishing a secret relationship with another man. Marcus asked me how long I had known about the affair before bringing it to the family, and I told him that I had discovered the first camera footage approximately 3 weeks ago, and that I had spent the time since then documenting the pattern and gathering additional evidence because I wanted to make sure I understood the full scope of what was happening before I made any decisions about how to proceed, and I explained that the reason I had not confronted Mara privately was because I suspected, based on conversations I had overheard, that she was already building a narrative where I would be portrayed as controlling or abusive, and I wanted to make sure that there was clear factual evidence available that would prevent that kind of reframing. Mara's mother asked me directly whether I had any intention of trying to work on the marriage, or whether I had already decided that divorce was the only option, and I told her honestly that I had not yet made a final decision, but that it was difficult for me to imagine how trust could be rebuilt after this level of sustained deception. And I said that what troubled me most was not just the affair itself, but the calculated way that Mara had been using our shared resources, including our joint bank account to finance her activities with Troy, while simultaneously preparing to position herself as a victim of my supposed controlling behavior. Mara stood up suddenly from the table and said that she could not sit there and be put on trial like this, that this dinner was supposed to be about expressing her concerns about our marriage, and instead it had turned into an ambush where I was presenting evidence like some kind of prosecutor, and her father told her firmly to sit back down and said that she had invited this conversation by telling her mother that I was the problem in the marriage, and that if she had been honest about her own behavior from the beginning, then perhaps this confrontation could have been avoided. I remained seated, and I kept my voice calm and factual as I said that I had not planned to present this evidence today, but that once Mara's mother began the conversation by characterizing me as controlling and suspicious, I felt I had no choice but to provide the family with accurate information about what had actually been happening. And I said that I believed families should make decisions based on facts rather than on carefully curated narratives that omitted inconvenient truths. Mara sat back down, and she put her face in her hands and started crying harder. And her sister-in-law, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, reached across the table and asked if she could look at the timeline document again, And when I passed it to her, she studied it carefully, and then she asked me whether I had filed any kind of formal complaint about Troy, given that he was using his position as a building employee to conduct an affair with a resident client. And I told her that yes, I had filed a complaint with the building gym management 3 days ago, and that Troy had been suspended from his training position pending an investigation into whether he had violated professional conduct policies. Mara looked up sharply when I said this, and she asked me in a voice that was both angry and frightened whether I had gotten Troy fired, and I told her that I had not gotten anyone fired, but that I had reported behavior that appeared to violate clearly stated building policies regarding staff conduct with clients, and that whatever employment consequences Troy might face were the result of his own choices to engage in an inappropriate relationship rather than the result of my decision to document and report that relationship. Mara said that I was trying to destroy Troy's career out of spite, and that I was taking revenge by going after his livelihood, and Marcus interrupted her and said that she needed to take responsibility for her own role in this situation instead of deflecting blame onto me for taking appropriate action to address policy violations. And he pointed out that if Troy lost his job, it was because he had chosen to engage in behavior that his employer had explicitly prohibited, rather than because I had been vindictive or controlling. The dinner continued for another hour in this same tense atmosphere, with various family members asking questions and Mara alternating between tearful apologies and defensive justifications about why she had felt compelled to seek connection outside of our marriage. And eventually Mara's father said that he thought it would be best if Mara stayed at their house for a few days, while everyone had time to process what had been revealed and to think about what the appropriate next steps might be. And he looked at me and asked if I would be comfortable with that arrangement, or if I preferred that Mara return to our apartment. I told him that I thought some separation would probably be helpful at this point, and that Mara was welcome to stay with her parents for as long as she needed, and I said that I would make sure her belongings were accessible if she needed to come by the apartment to pick up clothes or other personal items. And Mara's father nodded and said that he appreciated my willingness to be reasonable about the logistics, even though the situation was clearly very painful for everyone involved. As I prepared to leave the dinner, Mara's mother walked me to the door, and she said quietly that she owed me an apology because she had allowed Mara to shape her understanding of what was happening in our marriage without questioning whether there might be another side to the story. And she said that seeing the documentation I had brought had been shocking and had made her realize that her daughter had been manipulating the narrative in ways that were dishonest and unfair to me. I told her that I understood that parents naturally want to believe and support their children, and that I did not hold her initial reaction against her. And I said that I hoped the family would be able to maintain relationships with me, regardless of what ultimately happened with my marriage to Mara, because I had always valued my connection to her family and did not want the dissolution of the marriage to mean losing those relationships entirely. Mara's mother hugged me and said that I would always be welcome in their home, and that they considered me part of the family regardless of whether Mara and I stayed married, and I thanked her and walked out to my truck carrying the leather portfolio folder that now felt both heavier and lighter than it had when I arrived. I drove back to the apartment building, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot for several minutes before going inside, because I needed time to process what had just happened at the dinner and to think about what my next moves should be now that Mara's family was aware of the affair, and now that Mara was staying with her parents rather than coming home. I realized that the family dinner had effectively ended the period of silent observation and documentation that I had been conducting for the past 3 weeks, and that I was now entering a new phase where the affair was no longer a secret I was keeping, but rather a known fact that multiple people were aware of and reacting to, and I understood that this shift in the situation meant I needed to start making decisions about legal representation and separation proceedings, rather than just continuing to gather evidence indefinitely. I pulled out my phone, and I searched for family law attorneys in the area, and I found several with good reviews who specialized in divorce cases involving infidelity and complex asset division, and I sent consultation request emails to 3 different attorneys explaining briefly that I needed representation for a potential separation from my spouse, and that I had substantial documentation of adultery that would be relevant to the case. I went inside the apartment, and I walked through the rooms that suddenly felt different now that I knew Mara would not be coming home tonight, or possibly for many nights to come, and I looked at the security cameras that were still mounted in their positions recording their motion detection clips. And I thought about how a simple decision to install those cameras after a building burglary had led to this complete unraveling of what I had believed was a stable marriage. I opened my laptop and I checked my email, and I saw that I already had a response from one of the attorneys I had contacted, a woman named Nina Cross, who said she had availability for a consultation on Tuesday afternoon, and asked if I could bring copies of any relevant documentation, including financial records and evidence of adultery. And I replied that Tuesday would work for me, and that I had extensive documentation that I would bring to the meeting, and I felt a strange sense of relief that I was finally taking concrete steps toward legal resolution, rather than just sitting in the dark watching camera footage and updating spreadsheets. Monday morning, I returned to work, and I went through my normal routine of responding to maintenance requests and checking building systems, and around 10 o'clock, I received a call from Derek Mills, the gym manager, asking me to come to his office when I had a chance because he had an update about the investigation into Troy Vance. I walked down to Derek's office on the second floor, and when I entered, he gestured for me to close the door behind me, and he told me that the building's Human Resources Department had completed their review of the complaint I had filed against Troy, and that based on the evidence I had provided along with additional information they had discovered during their investigation, they had made the decision to terminate Troy's employment effective immediately and to revoke his building access privileges permanently. I thanked Derek for keeping me informed about the investigation outcome, and I asked him whether Troy had been notified yet about the termination decision, and Derek said that Troy had been called into a meeting earlier that morning where he was informed of the employment action and where he was required to surrender his building access credentials and remove any personal belongings